Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Aiken. I'm mayor of the city of Missoula and consider it a privilege to be the mayor of the city of Missoula. I'm going to be mercifully brief this evening and offer you just a quick welcome. I just discovered actually the first real, I think, effective use of PowerPoint. Some folks came in, looked at a screen, saw that they weren't in this hall and left. So, next slide. Came back, excellent. So in my line of work, we do not often have the opportunity to explore issues with much depth. And when we do those explorations, we often don't treat each other as well as we ought to, which is why this sort of activity, this sort of discussion, the discussions that have been going on over the course of the weekend here in Missoula, I think are so important. The fact that folks can sit down and discuss something that's clearly important to the folks not only in our community, but in our larger community, folks who have traveled here to learn more about what the big rigs mean. As a person who is occasionally considered a wide load himself, I have spent some time trying to understand this issue. I hear fairly consistently from the folks I serve that instinctually, at a gut level, folks just don't think this is the right thing for Missoula. They don't think it's the right thing for the corridor. Those instincts, that notion does not necessarily translate into public policy. So conversations like this one are really important as we march along. It's been interesting for me, the city of Missoula has not formulated a particular response to this issue, in no small part because it's one of those rare occasions where we don't feel particularly powerful. I don't, and I don't think the city council feels as if we have many tools to manage all of this and the questions before us. So I think we're looking for guidance again from smarter people. Always good to have a Nobel Prize winner offering occasional advice. And the rest of the panel is pretty bright too, as it turns out. I do want to thank the Department of Environmental Studies here at the University of Montana, the good folks at Christ the King Parish, our friends at St. Patrick Hospital and Health Science Center, and the Northern Plains Resource Council for sponsoring the event tonight and providing an opportunity for folks to talk in an intelligent, thoughtful way about an issue that's important to many of us. And I am going to duck out because this is not my first panel discussion of the day, but I'm going to tune in. Thank heavens for technology, and hope to learn more. And I hope you all have an interesting and satisfying experience. My predecessor in this job once told me that there are 8 sides to every story. It's always fun to learn what those sides are and then pick yours and move on, take some action. So with that, I'll turn this over to Beth Shank, who will moderate this evening's panel. And thank you all for being here. Appreciate your work as well. Beth.
Good evening. I second our mayor's welcome to you all and are so glad to have you all here and glad to have this opportunity ourselves. You may wonder why this coalition of sponsors has come together. And another sponsor to add on is the Indigenous Environmental Network, and we have Marty Coveney from that group with us. It's in part because this is a complex issue, both the more global issue of the tar sands and our local issue of the big rigs, and also the way that the tar sands touches in eastern Montana with the pipeline. get, as Mayor Engen alluded, to discussions that are hard to dig a little bit deeper. And so one thing that we wanted to do was be able to bring in some aspects of spirituality and morality into this discussion. This is the fourth and final event of our conference this weekend that you may have heard about, called Turning the Tide, Reclaiming Human Health by Restoring the Planet. And so we've spent the last 4 days talking about a lot of these issues and learning from each other and with each other. So this is another opportunity in that regard. The tar sands oil development project in northern Alberta brings with it significant impacts. In western Montana, we are on the route of the KMTP big rigs, transporting equipment from Korea to the tar sands by way of Lolo Creek, Missoula, the Blackfoot River, and the Rocky Mountain Front. Eastern Montana is also in the thread as the oil leaves Alberta and is transported through pipelines to refineries in the U.S. Because we are on this thread, we are involved. In this panel, we will explore impacts from several perspectives: ecological, economic, health-related, as well as impacts on our Indigenous communities, on our local land and business owners, and our own personal obligations. So I'm really pleased to have this august panel, and we have a lot to say, so we will get on with it, starting with Dr. Steve Running, who is the UM Regents Professor of Ecology. He has spent more than 20 years in climatology research. He is the one with the Nobel Prize that the mayor referred to, and we welcome his comments. Thank you.
Maybe it'll feel less formal if I don't stand up. That helps. Well, let's see. Where should I start on this particular topic? I suppose I could start with a few of the latest climate statistics globally. You probably have all read that 2010 tied for the hottest year on record globally. You probably have, well, maybe you haven't seen the trajectory of CO2 emissions and atmospheric CO2 that passed 390 and was only a small slowdown during the economic recession, and is now starting back up again. There's no evidence that we see scientifically that any of the climate impacts or the forcing agents for these impacts are slowing down at all. So the planet is on what we called in the IPCC report the business as usual, or A1FI scenario, which is basically burning all the fossil fuel you could get from anywhere you could get it. And that's basically what the planet's on right now. What a number of fossil fuel experts are starting to suspect is that we might have hit peak conventional oil. If you've read about the peak oil issue for many decades, it's been projected that there comes a point when oil production peaks, and then as the oil gets harder and harder to extract, that production goes down. And there's beginning to be evidence that peak conventional oil might have been reached now. And I think what we're going to see from here on out progressively are the oil companies working harder and harder to get oil. And of course we saw this in the Gulf oil spill, that they're drilling dramatically deeper than they were 10 years ago. And now we see in our own backyard that major oil production is now coming from the tar sands. And that has accelerated dramatically in the last few years. There's probably some of the other panel members probably know more of the statistics better than I do. And clearly, yeah, it's a mixed, we have mixed feelings. I sure do on this. I'd rather buy oil from Canada than a lot of other countries that we could all name. And so from a political point of view, this seems like an improvement. The biggest problem is that the extraction and refining of these tar sands is the largest carbon emitting type of oil production that's ever been done. So this is about the worst kind of oil generation you can get, and yet it's clearly now at a price point where the companies find it profitable to do so. Well, one of the ways they find it profitable to do so, of course, is to minimize cost every place they can. And what I find so outrageous of this particular maneuver is that the only reason they're hauling this heavy equipment through our backyard and community is simply to save some money. The steel fabricators in Edmonton could have built all of these right up there. And the reason they're building them in South Korea and towing them across the ocean and towing them through our backyard is to save some money. And that's what I really find outrageous. They didn't need to do it this way. And they made the conscious choice that we didn't matter. That just running these trucks by the hundreds through our communities and backyard didn't matter to them. It was saving them some money. And I'm afraid that we're just in for more of this kind of oil production as we go into the future unless we start resisting it in a way that hopefully a few of us do tonight. And so I don't find this as the way that we need to be and should be developing oil resources, and I really hope electric cars come sooner rather than later. And I think that's enough from me.
Thank you, Steve. Next on our panel is Dr. Georgia Milan. Dr. Milan is the medical director at Women's Care Center at St. Patrick Hospital. She's a family practice physician and is a graduate of Mayo Medical School. She has practiced medicine in Montana for 15 years and spent 10 years in the Indian Health Service and has traveled extensively to help provide health care and learn from Indigenous people. She has a special interest and experience in environmental health and its implications for human health.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Good. You know, I have been very honored to work with Beth doing this Turning the Tide conference, and it was very important that we started Friday night with Father Jim Hogan and a panel talking about spiritual solutions to a planet in peril. Because what we're talking about tonight, these are moral issues, these are ethical issues, these are all spiritual issues. And the bottom line is that we are addicted to oil. And we act just like any of the addicts that I've seen and I take care of. And that's, we're in a lot of denial, we have a lot of distraction, and we're pretty darn desperate. You know, when you look at the CO2 emissions, when you look at the fossil fuels, which are finite. And it's interesting because a good friend of mine pointed out the other day that just like any addict, you know, you get to the lethal dose. You know, you just kind of keep using and using. And then you get to the lethal dose, and then you die. And I've worked with a lot of addicts, and, you know, we all do the best we can, but those are personal choices. But when that lethal dose affects my daughter, who's here in the front row, my other daughter, you know, hopefully some grandchildren someday, but a whole future, it's not okay. And we all need to take great responsibility. ExxonMobil did make $45 billion in profit in 2009, and they do want to save some money. And they want to save some money because we are the market. They spent $145 million just in lobbying last year. That wasn't even talking about elections. That's just in lobbying. Who said that that's okay? why are so many deals being done that we don't even know about? Well, we need to know about it because we are the problem and we need to be the solution. And I'm glad that they are looking at putting an industrial corridor in Montana because it wakes me up, because I can no longer deny and be distracted from what's happening in the tar sands in Canada. And what's going to happen with the corridor here through Idaho, through Montana, is that, yeah, they're hauling a couple of big rigs right now. I mean, it's unbelievable, 650,000 pounds and 26 feet wide when the road's only 22 feet wide. And we've all been down Highway 12, and we know how sacred it is, how special it is. And yet I know as a human doctor, as we have failed Libby, as we have failed so many people all over the world, because we can't say, oh, this one act is going to cause someone to die. We rarely can do that. And so I do know that by hauling these big shipments, and the first few go to Billings, I don't think that's any coincidence. They're not going to the tar sands. It's kind of a distraction to us. The other, 205 are going to go to the tar sands, and the company in Korea says that they expect another 1,200 shipments. Make no mistake, this will be an industrial corridor. And this little 22-foot wide road, it's not going to be enough. I mean, it is going to be widened, and the mountains will go, the ecosystem will go. And as someone who's been very involved with ecosystems and biodiversity, I'll tell you this. I don't know what's going to happen if the bull trout become extinct. There's salmon in the river, there's lots of animals and plants. But I do know that we count on every part of this big ecosystem that we call biodiversity. I know why we're seeing so much West Nile virus. It's because we don't have many bird species left. We know that. We know that as doctors, but we don't really talk about it. We know why there's so much Lyme disease, and that's because of what we did to the habitat and enabled the white-footed mouse not to have so many competitors. And so we have Lyme disease everywhere. I mean, there's millions of examples of this. At least once a year, we're coming up with new human pathogens we didn't know before. We have no antidote for because of what we've done to the ecosystem, because of what we've done to biodiversity. And so when we look at what's going to happen to our ecosystem, it's going to be huge because we don't know. When we look at what's happening at the tar sands, we know that 40 million acres of boreal forest is gone. So we can see the trees, so we talk about the trees. In 1 cubic centimeter of dirt, there's billions of organisms. These are whole ecosystems. So when we talk about 40 million acres of the boreal forest, which is considered the second lung of the earth, this is the second fastest devastation of forest, of vegetation on this planet. This is a huge, what we call carbon sink, because we think of everything very anthropocentrically as far as how does this affect humans. Well, the boreal forest is a huge carbon sink for us, and not only can we not use it to sequester all this huge amount of carbon, but we are burning it and creating even more CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases. So we are just wiping out this boreal forest. The other thing about the tar sands is that, like Steve Renning said, it's a terrible way. I mean, even if we weren't addicted, which we are, and this is a finite supply, it's a horrible way to get oil. It's very not like conventional oil. So you have to go in with these big rigs, right? These huge pieces of equipment that they're dragging down Highway 12, and you have to dig up 2 tons of dirt. And boreal forest, all the animals, the plants, the micronutrients, the soil, you have to dig up 2 tons of earth for 1 barrel of bitumen. Okay, so that's the excavation part of it. And then what they have to do is try and clean the bitumen out of the rest of the ore, out of the sand, out of the clay. So then they have to use another 3 to 6 barrels of water for each barrel of bitumen. Plus the natural gas that they're using, they figure per day could heat the 4 million homes. The water could take care of a city of 4 to 5 million people. This is per day. So we're using all this water, and we know 40% of the world's population is water stressed. We take water for granted in our culture. We use over 165 gallons of water a day. Most of the world uses less than 25 gallons. We are very water stressed. So we're taking all of this water to get this bitumen, which is very, very dirty oil. And then what's happening to this water? Well, some of it is put back in the Athabascan River. Some of the water is taken from the Athabascan River. Others is from the aquifers, so it's depleting the water sources. And then there are these huge tailing ponds that people have heard about. Someone gave some statistic that if you put these tailing ponds in 45-gallon barrels, you could have a line of them from the Earth to the moon and back 15 times. And I know my husband is always saying, that drives me crazy when they say things like that. But it's just unbelievable, the quantity of these toxic tailing ponds. And these tailing ponds are, so you can see them from outer space. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of volatile, polycyclic, aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, horribly toxic stuff. You know, these are the tailing ponds that 1,600 ducks landed on, I think a year and a half ago, and were dead within a very short period of time. This is very toxic. Yeah, dissolved. The ducks were dissolved. That's not good. So all of these toxic tailing ponds are just sequestered in dirt pits that started out 24 feet high, and now they're 320 feet high. And they're 50 meters from the Athabascan River. The Athabascan River is one of the third largest watersheds in the world. And this is leaking, and we know this. In fact, there's new science that just came out from Dr. Schindler in the last 3 months. It's leaking. Now, if one of these earth dikes breaks, it's catastrophe. I don't think the world is going to survive that. So this is what we're looking at. And so this is the biggest industrial project in the world that's going on in Alberta, what used to be such a beautiful part of the country. And then what's happening is the people downstream, who are the first people, they're dying, right? I mean, they knew years ago, hey, these fish have tumors, the water doesn't taste right, the water doesn't look right. But they're First Nations people. I mean, you know, they're pretty low on the totem pole, right, so to speak. So they knew, and they were dying. And so their doctor, who worked there from 2002 to 2007, stood up and said, you know, there's something very, very wrong. I am seeing very rare cancers. Their cancer rate had gone up 30%, their systemic lupus rate, they had liver disease, kidney disease, and the Canadian licensing board threatened him with suspension of his license because he was causing undue alarm. Well, now they finally have proven 3 months ago that, yes, all of these toxins are in fact in the Athabascan River, and the people downstream are in fact dying. So now we have a body count, and that always makes us doctors feel better. We like the body count, because then we can say irrefutably, this is causing that. And as we know from the President's panel on cancer prevention, rarely can we do that. They pointed out we have 85,000 toxins. We only have studied 200 of them, so we're toxic soups. The Athabascan River is a toxic soup, and so we really don't know the impact. But now we have a body count, and we're getting a body count upriver from the particulate matter in the air. So this is what's going on in the tar sands, just a little brief description. And then I think Marty's going to talk about how they're then sending the bitumen in pipelines, which are going to crisscross the United States. And this is Kalamazoo, Michigan, which I was born a few miles from Kalamazoo, Michigan, so it's very near and dear to my heart. This summer, they had a 30-inch of pipe that broke, and they had 1 million gallons of bitumen, heavy crude oil, spill into the river. 1 million gallons, and they couldn't turn off the valve for 13 hours. It came 80 miles to Lake Michigan, the major drinking source for millions of people. That would have been catastrophic. And so it was interesting because I was looking at a report from the National Institute of Health last night, and their scientist was saying, this was very interesting, he was saying heavy crude oil, which is what bitumen is. You know, we consider it light oil, what was in the Gulf, but the heavy crude oil has hundreds to thousands of chemicals that we haven't even identified, that we don't even know the toxicity. Of course, we know arsenic is toxic, you know, so there's dozens we know, but what they're saying is there's hundreds to thousands of chemicals we haven't even identified the toxicity is amazing. And mostly what we know is that there is acute toxicity, but now they're starting to look at this weathered toxicity. So when you have this stuff sitting around, what's going to happen is it actually can dissolve DNA. It can change our chromosomes. And this stuff is going to be piped all over, thousands of miles underneath the United States soils. And the people in Nebraska and that part of the country are very worried because the Ogallala Aquifer, our largest aquifer, runs right there. You know, that a third of all of our irrigation is from the Ogallala Aquifer, plus the drinking water for many, many states. And they say, boy, you worry about ecoterrorism, look at those pipelines. So we're looking at huge, and it's interesting because the scientist also said out of 356 tanker disasters over this last 20 years where huge amounts of oil were spilled, I don't know why, but we only studied, he says, less than a handful, so maybe 4, out of 356 huge tanker dumps. We don't want to know, do we? We don't want to know the effects. But the effects are drastic, they're long-lasting, and they are killing us. They're killing us because of the CO2 emissions. They're killing us because of all of the toxic chemicals in the water. And now they want to come across Montana and Idaho. You know, this is our backyard. And as Steve Running was saying, this world is our backyard. And I'm saying, not now. It's not on my watch. It's not on my land. I am not going to let them come through this part of the country. I am not going to let them continue this tar sands if there's any way that I can help. The other thing is, this seems very minor to me, but we do know that emergency traffic is going to be tied up. We know that. The reason this is important to me right now, besides I'm a doctor, is my beloved sister, 2 months ago, 56, no risk factors, had a heart attack. And 5 minutes later, she would have been dead, but they were able to get her to the hospital and do a life-saving procedure. Every minute counts. They're not going to get by those big rigs. They can drag as many ambulances behind them as they want. It's going to slow it down, and we are going to suffer. So I guess that's the main thing I want to say. I've probably done over 10 minutes and have many more pages. But thank you for your patience and for listening.
Is Marty Kobene. And he is from the Indigenous Environmental Network, and he is the pipeline organizer for the nation. Oh, yeah. And he has worked on this topic for about the last 3.5 years, and he's next.
Hello, my name is Marty Kobene, as aforementioned. I think I'm actually becoming a resident of Missoula here pretty quick. I think I've been here for the last 6 months, like a week at a time, so I think I'm officially a resident. For those who don't know, oh, cool. This is what the tar sands looks like. This isn't like, you know, Jed Clampett shooting at some food type deal. This is really looking like molasses, mud. That is what we talked about earlier from the earlier panelists. This is what it starts out as. Right now, in the yellow is where they're going to be drilling for this oil. And only 20% of the oil is actually going to be dug up by cranes and by heavy equipment. 80% of the oil is going to be used through a technique called SAGD or in situ, where they're going to, does anyone know about fracking? Yeah. And how dangerous that is? Yeah. This is basically the same concept as fracking, is they're going to put the steam down into the earth with the chemicals, and they're going to separate the oil from the sand underground. And then they're going to suck the oil out. And that's how they're going to start doing this. That's going to cost a lot of money also. That's also going to cost, as we talked about earlier, natural gas. You're going to end up polluting the aquifers. You're going to be doing a lot more damage than what's being done right now that we can see. This is the exact same land. One is the boreal forest beforehand, and obviously the strip mining and what it looks like afterwards, where they take off the overburden, is what they call it. And then they always say that they're going to reclaim the land and make it back to nature. So they're going to make swamps and boreal forests and peat bog and everything else like that that normally actually filters water and everything else so we have fresh drinking water. But they're going to recreate that. Being facetious. It normally takes 4 barrels of water to make 1 barrel of oil. That's their current rate. When they end up doing the in situ and everything else and the SAGD, they're going to be pumping it down in there. So they're going to be using more. When we talk about using even more natural gas, I don't know if you guys ever remember the McKinsey gas pipeline that's being proposed from the North Slope of Alaska down to the United States. That's supposed to be natural gas pipeline. The thing that in 30 years, they haven't passed that yet, but the Canadian government is now starting to permit that. And the reason they're starting to permit that is because the McKinsey pipeline is going to have a major hub in Fort McMurray in Edmonton. So this McKinsey pipeline is going to come straight through the tar sands, thus where they're going to be used mostly to extract more tar sands. The doctor earlier talked about creating tailing ponds. Right now they are 67 square miles and they are 300 feet deep. The tailing ponds number 1 in particular leaks 17 gallons per second. When you multiply that out, which I have, is over 5 million gallons per year. 500 million gallons per year. To compare that to the Gulf of Mexico that we all heard about, and it was a great disaster and everything else, that was only 205 million. So this is double what happens every year for the last 40 years in Alberta. But no one's ever heard this story. So that's why we're here and why I work this and do this job. In comparison, as we already heard, the Enbridge Michigan oil spill was only, they say, some people between 800 to 1 million. I think we've kind of discussed the natural gas. In 2007, to talk about what we talked about with carbon emissions, is the tar sands used or created 400 million metric tons of carbon emissions in 2007. And when I went to New York or Washington, D.C. one time to do a public comment period on the Keystone XL pipeline, I got a business card from one of the Alberta government people there, and on the back it says, the tar sands only creates 1/1000th of the world's carbon emissions. Like it's a good thing. And that one just kind of didn't make sense to me either. I don't know if I'd be bragging about that too much, but they were, and they do. Just recently, the Canadian government has done a health study, and they have come out and said that there is a 30% increase in cancer rates to the people in Fort Chipewyan, which is 300 kilometers north downstream of the tar sands. Of that, they have very rare forms of bile duct cancers. Normally, it's 1 out of 100,000 people. Like here in the U.S., that's the stats on that. Right now, they have 3 confirmed cases, and the other 2 people that they thought had bile duct cancer had passed away beforehand, so they could never diagnose them. So that's 3 to 5 people out of a community of 1,200. But yet the government says it's not because of the water or anything else. But as the earlier panelists talked about, Dr. Schindler has come out, and it was kind of funny. Well, it's not really funny. Dr. Schindler came out with his study saying that the water's polluted and has all these chemicals in it, and 2 days later, the industry and the Alberta government came out saying, well, no, that's really not what. So they came out saying yin and yang don't match up. So they end up creating a new panel, and the new panel has come out, and 2 of the people have already quit because, one, there's no real science base behind some of the stuff that they're talking about, and the other one is there's no Aboriginal Indigenous person on the panel. So they haven't even begun doing anything yet. As we talked about, there's animals. We've talked about the fish. But one of the other things that the people up there have lost is one of their main food sources, which is the muskrats. The last time they've had muskrats was over 4 years ago. And during that time, they were finding them with bloody noses. And then when they were opening up the muskrat houses, they were getting strong smells of petroleum products when they'd opened it up. We've talked about the dead ducks. The company was found guilty. They were fined $3 million out of a possible $30 million maximum fine, which is a slap on the wrist for any big oil company. A week later, another 600 ducks landed on the same tailing pond and died. So they didn't really learn anything. And I really wish they had pushed the chairman of the board in jail for that one instead of just paying the fine. How does the tar sands affect the U.S.? One, pipelines, and we also have the heavy haul. Right now, they're proposing the Keystone XL pipeline, obviously. They've already done a Keystone 1 pipeline that goes from North Dakota, South Dakota, down to Cushing, Oklahoma. Which Cushing, Oklahoma, I didn't know if anyone ever been there. I went there this summer just for a drive, and I went there, and you know how they always say welcome to your community and everything else like that? Theirs is made out of pipe, and it says pipeline capital of the world. So I went and I was talking to the Chamber of Commerce dude, and he said that, I said, how much oil do you guys actually hold here? Because all you see is like great big tank farms of oil that hold 500,000 gallons in each one. And he said, we have 600 or 60 million gallons of oil here every day. We're expanding to 100 million, to hold 100 million a day. I said, are you guys a little bit nervous, like when 9/11 and stuff like that happened? And they said they actually had F-16s flying continuously around them during 9/11. So we sit and talk about national security. That's definitely it. I'm not going to talk too much about heavy haul. You guys pretty much know that. The Ogallala Aquifer. It's the largest aquifer here in the U.S. It is close to the surface. Some people, if you look it up on the internet and everything else like that, in the encyclopedia, not WikiLeaks or anything else like that, but it says it's like 15 feet below the surface. Unfortunately, I have a video that shows that it's 3 feet. That people can dig down to it in Nebraska using postal diggers. That serves 2 million people. Right now, both the senators and the governor of Nebraska are all on board saying you need to go around the Ogallala Aquifer and the Sandhills. Eminent domain, I think we have a landowner coming up here next, or pretty soon. He's going to talk about eminent domain a little bit more. In Oklahoma, there is a case where they have sued a family and taken them to court for eminent domain, but the family has countersued and saying that they don't have the right to take eminent domain because they don't have the permits yet, which is the presidential permit which has not been signed yet. I believe there's also 12 South Dakota cases that are pending. Some of the things that IEN is doing. I've talked about that I've driven around quite a bit. Well, one of the things that I'm doing is going around getting tribal resolutions from the tribes. This doesn't go through any of the tribes per se through the reservation lands, but it does go through their traditional homelands and some of their treaties. The 1868 Laramie Treaty is basically in South Dakota with all the Lakota tribes, and only 6 of them have said we're not taking the money. One of the tribes has taken the money from that treaty. The other 6 are saying we didn't take the money, so that land is still ours. So I don't know if you guys remember, but last summer when Congress went on break and took a recess, there was a law somewhere in there, and it was passed that said South Dakota went back to the indigenous people. And it lasted for the weekend. And President Obama said he wasn't going to go back and change it until they came back. So like for 3 days, 4 days, the Lakota actually went and took over Pierre, South Dakota. Some of the other things we've been working on, I'm not going to I do have a video, but it's like a 3-minute video. We obviously have pipeline leaks. This is in Deer River, Minnesota. If you look way down on the far left-hand side, you can see a machine. That's actually where this pipe broke. That was a 1-inch crack in the pipe. If you look in the main section of the picture, though, you see round tubes laying on top of the ground. That is pipeline. That is from 1949. That goes through northern Minnesota. That pipeline is still in use, and they use it every day. But they always say pipeline safety is wonderful and everything else like that, and they have monitors in them. But the monitors are only good for 1%, up to 1%. So if 1%, under 1% of the pressure is lost, it doesn't set off an alarm. And even when you do have an alarm, like in Kalamazoo, Michigan, it takes 13 hours for them to shut it off. This was actually discovered by firefighters. There's a forest fire in the area, and if you look at the trees and stuff like that, those are actually all burnt up. And I know you're going to think Minnesota and everything else, and you see all the white in there. That's actually that's not snow. It's those. They're diapers, what I call diapers. They're specifically designed to suck up and clean up oil. They won't suck up water, and all they'll do is suck up any additive or anything like that on it. So when you look back at that last one, that is all those diapers, and it's disgusting. And there's other ones that I have that are even more than that. I don't think I need to go over the culprit number 1. That's going up the road now. And that is what the Imperial Exxon loads are going to be looking like. Here's my information. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I guess we're going to have comments or something afterwards. Thank you.
So the first 3 panelists, as you can tell, have been kind of painting the big picture and talking about the tar sands in general with hints at our local impacts, both on this side of the state with the big rigs and on the eastern side of the state with pipelines. So our next 3 speakers will look a little bit more closely at what is happening here. And first, Mr. Bob Gentry will describe the heavy haul projects, what is proposed, what is actually happening, et cetera. And Mr. Gentry is an attorney who has been an environmental attorney for about 18 years. He's worked on some important cases, one of which you know well, which is the state of Montana versus ARCO, which gave us our big Superfund settlement just here on our very river and upstream. Also currently an immigration lawyer. So please welcome Bob Gentry.
Thanks, Beth, and I appreciate being here tonight. The actual industrial tar sands operation seems a bit remote to us most of the time around here, kind of out of sight, out of mind. And there's also some powerful framing that we're all familiar with that says, calm down. It's going to be okay. This is fine. You know, this is Canada we're talking about after all. It's not Nigeria. It's not Saudi Arabia. It's not Indonesia or one of the many other countries that the U.S. gets our daily dose of oil from. And there's also a frame that says if you drive a car, if you heat your house, if you buy basically any product that you don't totally and completely grow and make yourself, then you use petroleum. And so you have no right to criticize the tar sands or any other type of petroleum production. So we all know that that's powerful framing. And if one was unaware of Canada's sacrifice of at least and maybe more than 10% of its existing boreal forests, and the climate change impacts and the fish and wildlife impacts and the environmental justice impacts of that activity to get tar sands, if one were unaware of that, then one might say, how do I advance this? Just click?
I think so. Or maybe that.
Okay. There it is. One might say Alberta oil is conflict-free energy, or they might say, any of these people who say they don't like the oil sands, you ought to ask them if they'll invite you to eat at their house, or And unless they're living naked in a cave and eating nuts, they're totally dependent on petrol. And of course, this was stated by our governor. Now, if one were aware of the impacts of the tar sands, the real impacts of the tar sands, if one were aware of that, they might say something like this. You see how they produce their crude oil there? They poisoned every town along every pipeline route. The big rivers and lakes that used to produce large quantities of fish, the fish are all dead. This was also Governor Schweitzer, but of course he was referring to Nigeria and saying that the tar sands is so much better than Nigerian oil. So my intent is not to take cracks at the governor, but he's a public figure, he's a politician, and he made these statements, and these people should answer to the accuracy or inaccuracy of their statements. So in around spring of 2010, my colleague Summer Nelson acquainted me with a group of individuals here in Missoula called Northern Rockies Rising Tide. And I went to their meeting because they said they had a highway project that they thought I should take a look at. I worked at the highway department for a few years after the ARCO case, so I had some experience with highway issues. And they described this project to me, and I was just incredulous. You know, I thought surely they were wrong, but of course, over the course of time, I found that these people with Northern Rockies Rising Tide were extraordinarily well informed and dedicated to the issues that they were working on, and I admire them greatly. But as a result of that acquaintance, I found out about this Kearl Module Transport Project. It's one that's proposed by Imperial Oil. It's a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. This is from the environmental assessment, and it's a general description of the project. And you can see that they're going to ship 207 at least modules that are manufactured in Korea, and going to ship them across the Pacific to the Port of Vancouver, Washington, up the Columbia, up the Snake River, to Lewiston, Idaho, and then onto trailers and onto Highway 12 over Lolo Pass. That's up the Clearwater and the Locksaw, over Lolo Pass, down there to Missoula to 93, up across the Bitterroot, through Missoula on Reserve, a little stretch of I-90 over to Bonner, and then up Highway 200 along the Blackfoot and along the small roads along the Rocky Mountain front and into Canada. And they're doing this, they describe it in their document that this is part of their global execution strategies. I highlighted that because that's an interesting phrase, but what it means is it's a lot cheaper to manufacture these things in Korea than it is to manufacture them here, and it's all about increasing profits. So in order to do this in Montana, Exxon is proposing to permanently modify the roadways that it passes, all of these highways. And this is a list of the permanent modifications they're making: utility lines, changing traffic structures. This means like the signal lights on Reserve Street are going to put on rotating bases, permanent rotating bases, so that they can be moved out of the way for these loads and every load in the future that's going to come along this route, and then rotated back. All of these, they talk about modifying 22 existing highway turnouts. By modification, they mean making these things as long as a football field and wide enough to allow these huge modules to pull over. And they're adding 53 new highway turnouts, which they say are going to be a great benefit to the Montana public, because everybody knows we need a lot more room on the highway to pull over and use our cell phones. And road surfacing and minor amounts of tree trimming, whether it's by saw or by the modules going through and knocking off branches, which we've already seen in Idaho has happened. So these are permanent modifications to a roadway. Here's the route map. The red is the way they're coming in at Lolo Pass and the various small roads that they're taking to get up to Sweetgrass. The green is how the unloaded trailers are coming back. And this is a typical, there are lots of questions about just how big are these loads? You know, you hear numbers floating around all over the place. This is a typical diagram from the transportation plan. So this is directly from Exxon, from Mammoet, their hauler. It's kind of hard to see the details there. That's a 14-axle trailer with a push and a pull tractor. This is some of the data that's included on that typical. This is not the smallest load, and it's not, of course, not the smallest, but it may not be the largest either. And you see that the total load weight is going to be 633,450 pounds. The length is 212 feet, and the width is around 26 feet, height around 30 feet. You know, I was incredulous, and when I started looking through public documents associated with this project, I found that I wasn't the only one. Northern Rockies Rising Tide wasn't the only incredulous group. This is actually an excerpt from a memo generated by MDT to brief Director Jim Lynch. This was generated by the highest levels of MDT personnel. And it looks like a listing of the complaints that people made during the public comment period a year later. But this was MDT staff. This was what they thought of this project. I'm not going to take time to go through each one of these individually, but if you just briefly look at it, you can see a lot of things that are familiar based on the public complaints that have been made about this project already. And in July of 2009, Director Lynch made a presentation to the Montana Interim Legislative Revenue and Transportation Committee. This is a committee of the Montana legislature that meets between the biennial sessions and are advised by various directors of different state agencies. And Director Lynch made a presentation based on his briefing from staff about this project. And during that presentation, many of you have seen these quotes before, this is going to be a major impact to activities that are currently operating on this corridor, if it's allowed to go forward. We're talking to 200 to 500 loads. We're no longer talking about a single load. He's talking about the difference between what MDT normally does with the oversized load permitting. These these small, short length permits that they grant a number of them, but rarely have they've never encountered a project of this size or of this scope. And he says it's a significant impact to the state. Puts us into a totally different ballgame. Says it's a major impact on the state. MEPA, that's the Montana Environmental Policy Act, will play a role. Tend to agree with you that this would probably lend itself more to an EIS than an EA. An EIS is an environmental impact statement. It's the most thorough look that a state agency can take at a proposal for major state action. And of course, this one, you know, he was a sage in making this statement. But this will go like a firestorm in the community. And he was trying to advise these legislators that they need to know about this project because they're going to get lots of questions. And if you see at the bottom of that quote, you know, we're actually setting the stage for a high-wide corridor through the state of Montana to be used probably for things we haven't even imagined yet. Who would have imagined that this would be proposed? You know, can we only think what might be coming down the line? This was Director Lynch to the Legislative Committee. So by September of that year, he had changed what he said to this committee. This was an update. The environmental impact is minor, and they may have to prepare a very small environmental assessment to prepare for us before we can issue the permit. Well, I don't know. This is the cover of the preliminary decisional document that MDT generated. It's the environmental assessment, this little environmental assessment he was talking about. It was published in April of 2010. They opened a 30-day public comment period. And Summer Nelson and I made public comments on behalf of Rising Tide. And so did many other groups. In fact, MDT set a record for public comments opposing the project. They received over 23,000 public comments from all over the nation and all over the world. And actually, their email system broke down, so they only officially accepted 6,700 of those comments. When they talk about receiving comments from other nations, other states, other people, rather than seeing that as a reflection of how the entire world values this place that we live in, the entire world recognizes how special this place is. Rather than saying that, they dismissed any comments from out of state or out of the United States as having no relevance to what was happening with their decision. This, it's kind of hard to see. Well, it's a little bit better up there. This was their preliminary conclusion on impacts in that environmental assessment. And of course, I'm not going to go through this, but you see over and over, no impact, no impact, no impact. And in fact, they didn't even look at the cumulative impacts that could occur through using a corridor like this in the future for other loads of this type. During this whole process, we found out not only about the ConocoPhillips loads, 4 of which are coming through now. 1 of them's coming right now. The other 3 are waiting in Lewiston. We also found out that the Korean National Oil Company has approached both Idaho Transportation Department and Montana Department of Transportation about permits for another 50 to 100 loads. And we've also found out that Exxon is planning to, has a contract with Korean manufacturing companies to manufacture however many more loads could come from there, hundreds more loads. So we were getting ready to have some sort of response to a decision granting the permits. And in August of 2010, a really interesting thing happened. These 3 people in Idaho sued the Idaho Transportation Department on the basis that they didn't take the public interest into account when they granted permits to Conoco for its 4 coker drum shipments. These coker drum shipments are headed to Billings. They follow the same route through Idaho from Lewiston, basically to Bonner, Montana. And from that point, they head east to Billings as opposed to turning up 200 and going to the tar sands. It's only 4 loads versus 207. Conoco's not doing nearly as, they're not doing really hardly any permanent changes to Montana infrastructure to get these through. They're doing it the old-fashioned way with utility lines that get in the way. You just snip it, run it through, and then connect it afterwards. You use any wide spot on the road to pull over and try to let vehicles get by, what have you. Well, they had great success in this lawsuit that they filed in Idaho. This is the opinion from the district court. They got a permanent injunction against the Idaho Transportation Department requiring them to only allow 10-minute traffic delays rather than the 15 that the Transportation Department wanted to do. There's a regulation in Idaho, just as there is in Montana, that says when you run one of these loads, you can't stop traffic, you can't delay traffic for more than 15 minutes. So they won that at the district court, went through the Supreme Court, which sent it back saying that you need to go through an administrative process in Idaho before you can go to court. They went to the administrative process, and the administrative hearing examiner determined that they did not make their case, granted the permits, and now we see the first of these 4 Conoco loads moving. This is probably a familiar photo to most of you who have been keeping up with this, but on the second night of the Conoco movement, in a 31-mile stretch, they violated their 15-minute traffic delay rule 10 times. And in fact, 5 of those were for more than 26 minutes, and 1 was 59 minutes. And I haven't totally verified this yet. There are a few people in here who probably know it more than I do, but I've been told that the 59-minute delay occurred when this cradle that holds up the load, they basically locked it up against a rock wall on a turn. And this isn't even the most challenging stretch of the road. So this load has been sitting out in Kuski, Idaho for the last 3 or 4 days based on bad weather. They've had a really hard time. And with 10 violations of even their 15-minute rule, it really doesn't look good for them. They're going to have to go back to the drawing board and come up with another transportation plan for the next load. The Idaho Transportation Department has told them they need to do this. How they're going to cure this hour-long delay, I don't know, but I'm sure they'll come up with something. So next steps, Montana Department of Transportation has stated again and again that it would not issue permits on the Exxon project until Idaho acts first and issues the permits. So, so until such time, excuse me, until such time, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That's quite a story.
Thanks.
Many people, when we consider this and consider really all of our, this whole project from the tar sands to the big rigs to the pipelines, have heard a lot about jobs. So that's of importance to us. We are struggling with jobs in much of the country and here included. And so we're really glad to have Dr. Steve Sininger talk with us about economic impacts of particularly the heavy haul, which he has explored in depth. He is a senior research professor and PhD economist at UM's Bureau of Business and Economic Research. He has worked on economic development, employment, public health, and social policy issues for over 40 years. His research and consulting with government and business on cost and economic impact studies have been presented at professional conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals. And so we welcome Dr. Steve Sininger to help explain that to us as well.
So there's talk about spirituality and morality, and what's an economist doing up here? And I have the less glamorous focus of cost and economic impact, which is not insignificant because as we look at the proposal about the big rigs or the heavy haul, whatever you want to call it, a lot of the claim to fame of this is that it's going to be a perpetual job machine, economic growth, manna from heaven, and it really has some cost involved with it, which are pretty much dealt away or ignored away by some of the major players. So that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. And I hope to point out that when we talk about cost, it's more than ExxonMobil's internalized cost. It's cost on all of us in terms of our community, our natural resources, and our environment. So basically, as I mentioned, the heavy haul is being marketed, as these projects frequently are, as a major job creation machine with a lot of employment gains for Montana. And with the one table that Bob was showing, no cost to anyone. There's not going to be any major environmental impacts, no job loss. There's not going to be any really significant traffic delays, zero probability of accidents, etc. And when you take all of those elements in that table, basically the only costs that are going to be there are highway modifications and a few other associated things like that. As an economist, that kind of piques my interest as to how we can have such basically a free lunch, which is pretty rare these days, but that would seem to be the case. What I do is I take a look at the proposal, and I'll give you a web reference very quickly on that, and that's the document I think Bob had in one of his slides. It's affectionately called the Curl Module Transportation Project Environmental Assessment, available online from MDT. But I go through this document, which is the basis for all those claims about jobs, no cost, etc., to see what really is going on from a professional economic perspective. And essentially, there are some costs, some of which would be potential, some of which would be very real and very immediate in terms of this project dealing with the big rigs. Lower property values and real estate impacts along the heavy haul route would be one of the costs that would need to be addressed. And these are really things that haven't been looked at, analyzed, which need to be if we're going to have a more comprehensive perspective or assessment on what's going on. There will be taxpayer costs for increased road bridge maintenance and for MDT's cost of monitoring and supervisory oversight. Again, these are costs which are not picked up in the document of decision-making, the environmental assessment. Cost of travel delays, disruption of emergency medical services and fire protection services, assuming the assumptions made in the Imperial Oil ExxonMobil proposal, there will be no traffic delays. They'll all adhere to a 15-minute rule, and I think a 10-minute rule, Bob, in Montana. So there won't really be any traffic delays according to their assessment. And then finally, when the claims are made about job gains, the employment benefits from the project, there's no discussion at all about any potential job losses which might come about as a result of this project in the travel outdoor recreation industry. And when you look at that industry in Montana, these are numbers taken from our own Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research here on campus at UM. You look at the reasons why people come to Montana, it's not to see big trucks. It's basically to look at some of the attractions, such as our mountains and forests. These are percentage responses on surveys which are done year after year, and these are the top 5 reasons why people come to Montana to visit, to spend money, to recreate. Mountains and forests, Yellowstone Park, open space land, rivers, Glacier Park. When you tick that up in terms of what it looks like as far as an industry, it's significant. State level, in 2009, tourism recreation spending just by out-of-state visitors, that does not include in-state spending, was $2.3 billion in revenue, 25,000 jobs, $661 million in personal income, $153 million in state local taxes. So it's a significant economic sector which is assumed to not be affected at all by the proposed 207 shipments from ExxonMobil, the additional shipments from the Korean company, and whoever else is getting in line to look at the low-cost, almost no-cost route through Idaho and western Montana up to the tar sand fields. Now, these are real easy to look at instead of numbers. Reasons why people come to western Montana and recreate. These are all local shots from somewhere along the route, either in the Great Burns Study Area, proposed wilderness, or along the Lolo watershed, Lolo Pass area. And this basically then would be the competing attraction. It didn't quite work. I have to see if I can get it to work. I think what I have to do is click it. It's a picture of a rig. That was the big surprise. It worked at home. My cat enjoyed it.
Uh-oh, yeah, that didn't work either.
Yeah.
think it's because it's not on the flash drive.
Okay, it's not, well, anyhow, it was a picture of a big rig. You've seen them on bob slides. They're big. They take up a large part of the road, and they're the competition for those natural attractions. Now, given that, the question in my mind as an economist is, could there possibly be any job impacts on the tourism recreation sector? And I come up with the big capitalized, underlined hypothetical if tourism and recreation spending in Missoula County dropped by 5%, fairly modest drop, it would represent a drop of $17 million using 2009 data. What would that look like in terms of an impact on our business community and on employment? And basically, I run this through what we affectionately call the IMPLAN, Economic Impact Model. It's used by state governments, used by the Department of Labor and Industry, and it's indeed even used by MDT should they wish to carry out a really comprehensive analysis. And running it through the IMPLAN model, basically for Missoula County alone, what that hypothesized but potential 5% drop would represent would be a loss of 327 jobs, $9 million in labor income, and $27 million in business revenue. And the hardest hit businesses in Missoula County from this loss, realizing this is tied to our natural resources, our amenity-based economy, the hardest hit businesses would be hotels, motels, retail stores, eating, drinking businesses, auto repair, gas stations, etc. And, you know, when we hear all this rhetoric these days about small business, and how we need to help small business, surely this would not be really the way of encouraging small business employment. So, it's just kind of a hypothetical exercise to lead to the final point. We need to have a comprehensive assessment and public discussion and objective analysis of all costs and who bears those costs. And basically, really in the longer term, in addition to what it's going to do to our environment and natural resources, what it means for long-term economic growth in terms of jobs from businesses, professional services, entrepreneurs, startup firms, which we have seen as a major component coming in and as an attraction to our natural resources and our public lands. That, in a nutshell, is the less glamorous, but I think important aspect of some of the cost issues of the heavy haul.
Next, we are going to hear from the landowner perspective. So we have with us J. Bob Yarger, who was raised in eastern Montana. His family is still are still landowners right along the pipeline route in eastern Montana. He currently lives in Missoula, but will be able to share with us a little bit of what that feels like from the landowners. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to say I apologize for the bad voice. I can't come up with a cold, so I apologize if I have to stop for water or what have you. Like she said, my name is J. Bob Yarger. I'm originally from eastern Montana. Grew up on a farm and ranch. I would be the fourth generation farmer and rancher, and so the proposed pipeline is very important. It brings very severe impacts to the land, to the way of life, to the water, to everything. So it started out, I'm a member of the Northern Plains Resource Council, a grassroots conservation and agriculture organization in Montana. So when the Keystone XL pipeline was proposed, a group of landowners formed the Northern Plains Pipeline Landowners Group. We organized to negotiate with the company an equitable contract which protects landowners and public safety. We now have over 40 members. As a landowner, one of my major concerns revolve around three main issues: safety of the people and environment, the abandonment of the pipeline, and the condemnation or the power of eminent domain the company is seeking. First of all, the safety. The disaster in the Gulf serves as a warning. If federal officials had paid more attention to the possible consequences of a blowout of BP's rig before the company was allowed to drill, we would have known before it was too late that there was no plan to contain the catastrophic spill. A spill along the Keystone XL proposal is a real risk, which would destroy our water, our land, and our way of life. For example, let's look at the safety or the quality of pipe. We do know that they have applied for a waiver from the Federal Department of Transportation to run cheaper, lower quality, and thinner diameter pipe. It is also our understanding that they have termed our area as low consequence, and that where they want to put the cheaper, and is where they want to put the cheaper quality of pipe. And around the pumping stations and where there are more people, it has been termed higher consequence. And that's where the higher quality of pipe and thicker pipe will be used. So basically, landowners, small communities, and their way of life are of no importance and are basically disposable. Also, it is our understanding that the steel being used for the pipe is from India, not inspected here, and who knows what kind of standards exist for pipe in India. However, as of now, they do not have the permit for this lower quality of pipe. Also, the complete emergency response plan has not yet been released for the Keystone XL pipeline, and the rural remote setting for most of the project makes the need for local participation in the decisions even more important. The largely volunteer emergency personnel and potentially affected property owners and others who live in the pipeline deserve an opportunity to comment on the TransCanada's emergency response plan prior to issuance of permits and approval of the plan. Safety is of utmost importance, and our local communities need to know that there is a good plan in place. This brings me to the other issue of abandonment. The draft environmental impact statement had no useful information on abandonment at the end of the expected 50-year life of the pipeline, nor did it address what the environmental impacts would be if the pipeline is abandoned prematurely. Of course, the company spokesmen say there is a never-ending supply of tar sands oil and that we as landowners shouldn't have to worry about that. I find that quite disturbing. Is TransCanada just going to abandon the pipeline in place? What will the impacts of letting more than 1,000 miles of 36-inch pipe rust in place? Will it be removed? Who will be responsible for the removal? The answer is the landowner is responsible. They are responsible for everything: the spill, the damage to the pipe. For example, if we happen to drive over the pipe with the tractor, and they determined that that was the cause of the break or the spill, then we as landowners would be responsible. Landowners and taxpayers need assurances in the environmental impact statement that the liability for abandoned pipe will not be transferred to their shoulders or to our shoulders. They also need assurances that this will be the only pipe transporting material. It is our understanding that the 110-foot easement, the company can put as many pipes that they want and do not have to notify us of any changes. So basically, we're giving them a right-of-way for 110 feet to do what they say now is only one pipe. But what happens if the tar sands project fails and they find natural gas? Here comes a natural gas pipeline. Or basically, with the contracts that have been proposed, we as landowners, we don't have that information, and so it's very disturbing. We can't make a decision. Further, another problem is the property value of the land. Let's say our kids or perhaps grandkids want to sell the land. Who's going to want to buy a piece of land that has a huge pipe carrying black sludge through it, and that there's no assurances that the pipe won't break, and that if it does, you'll be responsible? It's honestly a no-brainer, and nobody would consider buying the land. And so consequently, your land is worthless. All of this for what? A one-time $4,000 to $6,000 a mile payment? It's absurd and honestly an insult. The other issue that is very important to us is the idea of condemnation and the power of eminent domain that the company is proposing. I don't believe that the landowners and the producers of our food supply should be condemned for a pipeline which need has not yet been proven. If my productive farmland or ranch land is to be taken by a company for the purposes of constructing a massive pipeline to transport tar sands, crude oil from Calgary, Alberta to the Gulf Coast in Texas, with little to no benefit for those of us in Montana, then there should be a demonstrated need, and there hasn't been one yet. So as landowners and farmers and ranchers, it's very disturbing to see a foreign company be able to come in, be able to condemn your land for their profitable use. I feel that we are, in their eyes, very small players. We are inconsequential. We do not matter. And so our land, our water, our way of life is kind of just the cost of doing business for them. So there's one issue that I want to make, the power of eminent domain. There's a House bill, it's House Bill 198, is actually being debated in the state legislature. House Bill 198, and I apologize for those of you that know about this and are probably, well, more informed than I am. However, I understand House Bill 198 grants private corporations and possibly individuals the power of eminent domain. House Bill 198 seeks to set a precedent that would allow private corporations to take an individual's private property for corporations' private profit-making project that has no demonstrated public need. So the question that landowners keep asking is, how can a foreign corporation that is carrying foreign oil that will go to China and or possibly South Korea and who will not benefit Montana at all have the right to basically trespass on our land? I think it's criminal and at best unfair what they are proposing with the House Bill 198. House Bill 198, if it passes, then all of our concerns are irrelevant. All our concerns about the quality of land, the quality of the water, the quality of the way our life, it really doesn't matter because they've demonstrated that they can make more profit off it through taxes or what have you. And so we can't do away with individual rights in the name of big business. While I don't have a solution for you right now, I can tell you that if we allow House Bill 198 to pass, then we have a serious problem on our hands. For example, imagine that you're a rancher, not close to any oil, coal, natural gas reserves. You think you're in the clear. But then Cargill, ConAgra, or one of the other mega million-dollar wheat producers comes by your house and says you have to sell your rangeland to them for literally nothing, or they are going to take it because they can produce more in tax revenue from it. I think the situation is truly horrifying and way more real than we think. What I'm trying to say is that as landowners, if we are going to give a permanent 110-foot easement to a foreign company then we need to have answers to our questions. As of now, we have not received any answers. So, thank you.
Our final speaker tonight is Rich Bishop, and he is a member of Christ the King Church, and he's part of the Catholic worker community. He will help us tie this together a little bit with our spiritual concerns.
Oh. Are we feeling overwhelmed a bit? I wish I brought a pep band for us to drum up our enthusiasm about what the possibilities of what we can do. And when I was asked to come and speak, I was to talk about maybe personal responsibility, and I probably am the most unlikely person to be talking about that. But as Beth said, I'm part of the Catholic worker community, and it's a community that's been involved with a sense of spirituality. It was originally a spiritual renewal movement for the Catholic Church, but since then it's become very ecumenical. And from there, they started publishing a newspaper, which was to gather facts and information like we heard tonight and present it. There was a real spiritual component about social justice and how we treat people. And that philosophy was called personalism. And then, as they got into the 50s, they got into more action. Dorothy Day and Ammon Hennessy were part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and they decided they were not going to go into the bomb shelters when they were doing air raids and maneuvers to see what would happen if there was an atom bomb that was dropped. And they were jailed for 6 months for this, and it was the beginning of a whole nother element of the Catholic worker. Over the years, I think the worker at this point is probably more visible as being an activist movement, and specifically around the issues about war. And I think we all know that the war is around energy interests, and oil in particular. And we're seeing that, that war that was out in the Gulf, the Eastern Gulf, is now sort of coming back towards us. Our addiction to oil is, maybe our karma is working in a way that it's coming closer to home. So right now, it's like I listen to all the information that everybody has and all the great work, and I see everybody here that I'm sure it's like preaching to the choir. A lot of people know what the circumstances are, but I think we have all tried to do things from a very proper way, civil way. And to me, I don't know where we go with this. We have this information, we have the statistics, we have the evidence, we have research from universities that are telling us what's going on with the environment. And, our political leaders, we vote hoping that Obama's going to be able to bring more of a green economy, and we're going to see alternatives to dirty energy, whether it's nuclear power or oil. And then we have Clinton saying that it's better to we're going to get dirty oil no matter what. It's better to get it from Canada than from Iraq or from the Gulf, the Mideast. I'm disappointed in the sense that we are not moving to passive, healthy, clean energy. And it really comes down to the fact that we're facing an issue and a challenge that's so magnificent that it just seems to me that if we could have the Manhattan Project and put all this energy into developing a bomb and getting the government and our resources and our talents together to do that, that perhaps we might be able to start taking those kind of leaps now to do that, to move from dirty energy into something that's really safe. And I just want to close my comments with a couple of things. When I was a child, I was growing up in a place where it was a housing development, and my sister and I used to go out and play, and we would get involved with the tar. And we'd come back to the house, and we'd have tar in our hands and our hair and our clothes, and my dad was just, didn't know what to do, but filled up the tub with gasoline. And put us in the tub with gasoline to get rid of the tar. So, when I heard tar sands, for some reason that little thing came back. But also, I want to talk about this as a spiritual issue. Everybody remembers the Valdez oil disaster, I think, in this room. And if not, maybe people have read about it historically. Hopefully it's part of our history. But I have been reading this book called The Cosmic Christ by Matthew Fox. And I finished it. And the basic idea of the book was the crucifixion is basically what we're doing to the planet right now. It's a modern crucifixion. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's, if our sense of Christology is big and unitive in our consciousness, that's something that would make sense to me. The thing that was interesting, though, later was Good Friday. And the Valdez oil disaster, days later after I finished this book, happened on Good Friday in 1987. So there's a spiritual component of that. And the last thing, I think our sense of industries and corporations that are global, they have anonymous capital. They're relationships that aren't personal. We don't know who these people are. They don't know who we are. Things are centralized. And this is all at the expense of our personal relationships and our local aspect of determining what happens in our lives. And the development of friendships. I mean, when the Supreme Court says that a corporation it can have the rights of a person, that's kind of strange, So I think I strongly encourage that we meet in small groups, look for ways of developing our own economies, really work on alternative energies. Get together and experiment. Take a truck apart, a big rig, and see if you can create a windmill or something. And have fun. I mean, and that's the other thing is when we do those things, it will help us fight the fact that we can't do anything. you know? And that's, I think, one of the things I want to thank the organizers for this event, was just that we had this opportunity to sort of just spend time with each other and share this huge challenge that we face. I could go on, but I think that's it. And I think all of this also does help our prayer life.
Thank you, Rich, and please give us a round of applause for these wonderful panelists. Who have painted a rather heavy picture, but also with some levity and some hope. And so we do have some time for some questions, or comments and conversation, though I do see Rick Bass in the audience. I just wondered, Rick, if you'd like to make some comments.
Do you want to introduce him?
Yeah, you want a microphone? And Rick is the author of the book, Heart of the Monster, one of the co-authors of that book, as well as numerous other books of well-known writer from Yaak, Montana, and Missoula. So please, Rick.
Yeah, nothing I want to say to the panel was amazing, covered everything top to bottom. You know, there aren't 8 sides, well, there are 8 sides to this issue, but every one of them's wrong, and we heard why tonight. This isn't ambivalent. We can't have that luxury or that indulgence of thinking this, like you said, that it being framed as a complicated or nuanced issue. It's not any more complicated than slavery was or genocide. The scale of it is ecocide. And, you know, that argument, that framing argument, oh, you can't advocate for wilderness because you drive a car and you use roads. You can't try and stop these rigs going to the tar sands because you use oil and gas. It's exactly our complicity that authorizes us and empowers us to stop it, to draw a line and set some last things beyond our reach. And again, the scale of this is ecocide. It's terrifying and exciting to have the chance to stop it. It's double or nothing. And you guys really articulated well all of the 8 wrongs with this project. I used to be a geologist. I lived in the middle of a permanent industrial petrochemical corridor, and we don't want that in Montana. We don't want that in Montana. We don't even want it on Reserve Street, but we don't want it on the Rocky Mountain front.
And also, his book is for sale at the table outside, and there are other informational tables. So, yes.
Imagine that a lot of you are feeling like there's something you want to do about this. So I just wanted to say that there are groups working on this here in Missoula now. They work together, they overlap. Those groups you can find on the internet, and you can find what they're doing on the internet. There's No Shipments, Missoula. There's Northern Rockies Rising Tide, which was mentioned earlier. There's All Against the Hall. So if you can remember those names, you can find them on the internet, and they'll tell you what we're up to. Right now, there's a pressing need for monitors to follow the trucks. I mean, if it starts moving again, I'm hoping it's really never going to get here. But if it starts moving again, we need monitors to follow it and keep track of it and time it and record what it's doing. And Robbie here is coordinating those monitors. So talk to him if you can help out with that. There's lots to do. We've got lots of plans. So remember, No Shipments, Missoula, Northern Rockies Rising Tide, All Against the Hall.
Thank you. Any other questions?
This question mostly for Marty. I've been wondering about the refineries and the pipelines, and my understanding is they want to pump a lot of this far, far south. But are there not refineries in the center of the country that can upgrade this oil, the tar sands oil, and refine it? And what about the refineries down on the Gulf Coast? And what is the real reason for sending the oil down that way? Is it just for refining? and this is like an energy security question, what does it really mean for what's ultimately going to happen to the product when they're done refining it?
Good question. Is this thing on? Okay. The reason they're really wanting to put this pipeline down to Houston is because the refineries down there are already taking heavy crude from Venezuela. Most of us think that Venezuelan oil is sweet crude, light crude. It's actually not. It is actually a tar sands oil. Most of it is a tar sands oil coming from Venezuela also. So they're already equipped for that. There's also the Marathon refinery over in Detroit where this oil is going through with the Alberta Clipper. The reason they don't want to go to the refineries that they have to do the upgrades on is because it's going to cost them millions of dollars to upgrade. Actually, when you start looking at even where the cokers are going for Billings refineries take tar sands oil already. I don't know how it gets there because it's not coming through on pipe. I don't know if it's coming through on train or how it's getting there, but that is where that is why you have to have the cokers too, is to start refining the heavier oil. Yes, we all sit and talk about where this oil is going to. It's going to hit the world market. Obviously with OPEC and everything else. One of the reasons that they want to start going down to the Houston area is because Venezuela is obviously talking about not giving any more oil to the U.S. Mexico is running out of oil, so they want to start being able to bring more oil down to the southern parts of the United States to still fulfill the oil needs down there. So I think, does that answer your question?
A little bit of follow-up. I mean, could it go onto the world market, or it has to do with the prices on the world market? So essentially, it makes it easier for the oil companies to arbitrage, you know, the futures and all that stuff that go along with that to basically get more for it. If it's locked in a refinery in the center of the country, the distribution area is relatively small and limited, so they can't essentially make more money by brokering it.
Right. Sorry to cut you off there. This is a world issue already. When we go to, IEN has gone to several different areas in the world already. We've sent delegations up to Norway. I mean, you think of Norway, why would you think of Norway to send a delegation to? During the last Norwegian election for the presidency, there's 9 people on the running on the ballot. 8 of them were against the tar sands. The incumbent was for the tar sands. How's that important is their national oil company is owned 51% by the country. And they have monies and investments into the tar sands. Basically, every oil company in the world has investments into the tar sands right now. The last one that just got in there was Total, which is a French company. They just got their permits approved. Before that, it was actually BP was the last one to actually be in the tar sands. So yes, it is going to go global. And, you know, realistically, when we sit and talk about economics and everything else, the tar sands really didn't become feasible until we had gas prices going up to $140 a barrel. Because it costs about $120 to produce that, the oil from up there. So when you sit and talk about oil prices and everything else like that, we're already at closing in on $100 a barrel. We're going to be up there again, and so that's why the tar sands is becoming very feasible. They're saying now that the Canadian Oil Producers Association is now saying that their oil prices are starting, by cutting their production and well, not well, and it's actually the way they're manufacturing it and creating it, it's coming down in price. So now they're saying it only costs $75 to $80 a barrel to make the oil, which isn't any good either. But we're kind of stuck in it right now. How do we get out of it? you know, I don't think that some of us are going to be probably driving quite as much when it gets to $4, $5 a barrel. So, I mean, then you lose the demand. And I think, you know, just the general public is going to end up saying, we don't need this oil anymore. And then we also fight with companies. You know, Bed Bath & Beyond has come out to say, we're not going to take tar sands oil to make our products. Lush Cosmetics, that is a company up in Canada, has come out to say that. There's other companies in the U.S. that have come out recently to say, we're not going to take tar sands oil anymore. So that's good for us.
I had two questions. I had read that the amount of carbon loading from the tar sands project, if we allow it to go full guns, will be about an increase of about 40% over the carbon loading that's occurring right now. And I wanted to know if that was an accurate figure. And then the second thing I wanted to know about was, you know, we've seen this lawsuit or a series of lawsuits in Idaho. Why haven't we seen any lawsuits in Montana? And thank you all.
Well, I can give a shot at the first answer, but not the second one. I think what you're referring to is the carbon emissions from the processing, and all crude oil isn't created equal. And so the light sweet crudes can be refined with much less energy than the heavy tar sands. When you compare this tar sands processing to the light sweet crudes, it does take about 40%, 50%, even 60% more refining energy in order to refine these heavy tar sands. And so it isn't an exact number because there's all different grades of oils and bitumens that are processed. And this is about as heavy and difficult to process as anything. And now for the second question.
Could I follow up on that? As far as the overall, at a time when we should be reducing our carbon emissions, is it true that if we develop these tar sands, that the overall emissions from the planet will increase by 40%? That was my question.
Well, to the extent that these become a larger and larger fraction of the oil use by the country, then it's going to proportionally continue to increase carbon emissions.
On the lawsuit issue, I'll go as long as my voice allows me, but it's a bit legal wonkish to say it, but Montana has a law called the Montana Environmental Policy Act. I mentioned it before. It requires state agencies, when they make a final agency decision on something that could significantly impact the environment, to do an environmental review that involves public input. In this case, we had a public comment period on a proposed decision by MDT. MDT hasn't issued any permits on the Exxon project. They've issued permits for the first two ConocoPhillips loads with very little environmental review for that process. But as far as challenging the Exxon project, the 207 loads, we have to wait for a final agency decision to get into court. If you were to try to file a lawsuit right now, it would be dismissed because there is no final agency decision. Idaho's a bit different. They don't have a state environmental policy act. What they have there instead is if an agency is making a decision like this, they have to comply with their own regulations, and as they're getting, I'm not exactly sure what the trigger is, but at some point in time, they can initiate what they call a contested case administrative action. And that's basically a court-like hearing that occurs at the state agency. The agency hires a hearing officer to come in and act as the judge and jury. They make their decision, and once they make that decision through this contested case action, only then can they go to court. See, that's what happened in the first Idaho lawsuit. They went to court first. The Supreme Court said you didn't do this agency process, so they had to go back and do the agency process. And theoretically, they could have gone to court again after their agency process, but chose not to. And the third point that I would make on litigation is that it's expensive. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard for anybody to be prepared to file a lawsuit.
You know, I just wanted to say one thing to follow up, Bob. You know, two quick things. About carbon emissions, we have to remember that in the United States, 70% of our carbon emissions are from our cars and our trucks. And we are addicted to oil. And that our government, who is us, right, we subsidize the oil companies so we can continue to have oil available to us at relatively cheap prices. And so this keeps our addiction stronger and stronger. So when we talk about the true cost of oil, if we were looking at not having it subsidized, we would be paying a lot more for our gas. And if we were paying the true ecological damage, we would be paying probably $20 a gallon. And all I am saying is at some point, we're going to have to look at our heart of hearts, because what's going to get us off of our addiction is if we're paying closer to the true cost of our oil and our gasoline. And so we need to take that responsibility. Tom Woodbury gave me a fact that in Missoula, 48% of our gas is coming from the tar sands, gasoline we're using in our cars. I didn't fact check that. Tom, is that true?
I couldn't verify that because I read it in the Missoulian, so I don't know if it's true.
Well, if it was in the Missoulian, come on. But see, that's something for us to know. If the Missoulian says 48% of our gasoline is coming from the tar sands, we need to know that. These are ethical, moral issues for all of us.
Hello, folks. I'd like to thank all of you panelist members for shining light on some of these figures that may seem kind of, they bring an ouch when you say them, but thank you for continuing to do that. I've got a question that a friend down in Hamilton wrote, actually. He's unable to make it because of the roads. And Dave Jones, he says that in medicine, professionals are trained to look holistically at symptoms of sick patients and diagnose the underlying disease. So here we are discussing the health of our planet, and it seems that we would want to look beyond symptoms as well, those being the ecological damages. Surprisingly, we hear no discussion on the most fundamental source of the destruction, and that's our underlying political economy, liberal democratic capitalism. Our very own mayor, John Engen, in his welcoming address, admitted to feeling powerless against the evil oil companies of the world. So to turn that into a question, as we look towards restoring the planet, do we believe that we can do this within the framework of the so-called democratic capitalism?
Good question.
Wow. I'm curious about it too. I know Dave wrote it, but...
I'll try and capture some of that. A couple weeks ago, I was actually in Washington, D.C. to talk about the Supreme Court decision a year ago, to which corporations received the same rights as individuals. And at that point in time, we had a two-day conference on that and talking about corporate America and what we can do. And yes, I think we can, but I'm also an optimistic. So, you know, I think we can, I firmly believe in the sign that I think we can shut down the tar sands. And I still think we can shut down and say no to the Keystone XL. And I still think we can win the Imperial Heavy Haul. So I'm an extreme optimist. I think eventually we are all going to end up having to figure out a way to get around corporate America. And some of the problems with that is that corporate America runs the country. They run government. You know, when the government decided and the Supreme Court decided that corporations could spend as much lobbying money as they wanted to and donate as much money as they wanted to campaigns, that became a real problem. But I think that, yes, we do have a democratic process. And I mean, when one person can start changing things, it's kind of like the ripple. And I think we can really change that with the ripple. You know, when we talk about tar sands, we have Republicans and Democrats on our side. In Texas, we have the Tea Party on our side. When I went to Washington, D.C., I had the Coffee Party on our side. You know, it's not that we're all that different. It's a matter of us all deciding to come together and compromise some of our beliefs, but then to come together on a like everyone here is not in my backyard. Well, the U.S. is our entire backyard, and we all, as people, need to come together and come together on it and try and take it over again. How that's going to happen? It's going to have to take acts of Congress. You know, we actually had this conversation last night over dinner, and you know, how are we going to do that? You know, it's going to be difficult because when we do that, we're going to be taking on every corporation in the world instead of one at a time, like we do right now with oil companies and stuff like that. So I think we can do it, but it's just going to be hard, and it's going to take a total reform. And I think even when we start looking at the recession that we're just getting out of, and we start looking at oil prices going up to $120, $140 a gallon again, or barrel, I think the recession again, the U.S. isn't going to handle another recession within the next 5 years. And what some of the experts I've talked to, they predict it by 2013 that we'll be in our next recession. So I think then, and only then, I think they're going to end up shooting themselves in the foot, really. And we'll have to pick it up. I don't know if that answered your question or Dave's question. Economics?
There's a little bit of economics in all that. You know, just a historical footnote, we used to require corporations to have charters which were reviewed occasionally before they could be reauthorized to do business. And it was actually somewhere in the 1880s, 1890s when it was determined that corporations are an individual or have the same rights as an individual. And sort of got rid of the idea of charters, got rid of the idea of any social responsibility in terms of corporate capitalism. So there are movements of which I've sort of beginning to look at just in terms of what's going on of democracy in action in terms of trying to get a hold of the ways of looking at corporations and how they behave and what kind of regulatory or monitoring processes could be put in place. But when you look at the overall economic wealth and power, I mean, these companies we're talking about, ExxonMobil's profits last year were $40 billion, that's with a B. ConocoPhillips, complaining about how much these delays in Idaho are going to cost them, reported fourth quarter profits of $12 billion. So, you know, just the sheer economic mass and power of corporations is something it's quite daunting. There used to be an idea of countervailing power. I think John Kenneth Galbraith talked about that in terms of corporations, organized labor, and government. And that kind of countervalence is sort of evaporated because now we have government under attack. It's bad. Everything it tries to do is bad, supposedly. And organized labor has pretty much gone by the boards in large parts of certainly this country and the rest of the world, except for some of the European economies. And so what does that leave? It leaves kind of the big sole survivor on top of the heap with all the power. And I think as I've thought about it and as I've looked at it as it's happened around the country, there have been some very limited examples of local organizations and local communities which have come up with laws and ordinances which prevent corporations from coming into the community and using their monies to change laws and to lobby for their own benefit. There's an example in Pennsylvania. There's an example in North Dakota on that. So there are some very limited examples of where that happens, but it's certainly going to take much more than just those few examples to go against the massive economic wealth and power that we're talking about, which is pervasive, as your friend's question points out, in government.
You know, the mayor said that he didn't think he had much power to do anything on this problem, and it occurred to me that the city has to give them a trip permit of some sort. And I thought, well, why doesn't the city council vote the trip permit to be $1 million? And yeah, or $1 billion, okay, so maybe they say it's unconstitutional or something. Well, they would have to fight that in court, and that would take a long time. And so, to me, the first thing we ought to do is lobby our city council to increase this trip permit to whatever number you think is big enough, and defy them to knock it down.
I got one more comment to add to this question, just that I'm still trying to wrap my head around the notion of what is corporate free speech. I mean, who's speaking there anyway? But nonetheless, I mean, Citizens United is going to be an interesting period of U.S. history if, in fact, the U.S. survives it. But nonetheless, on a much more local scale, corporate decision making is very simple. It's there's no malice involved. There's also no concern for there's no social conscience involved. Their marching orders are very straightforward. Maximize profit. Externalize costs where legal. And if it's not legal to do it, doesn't it make sense if you're a corporation that you would change the law so that it would be legal to externalize those costs? So it's very simple how their decision-making process happens. In the case of the ConocoPhillips loads, in the case of the Exxon loads, you know, to bring it back home closer, what they're trying to do is externalize costs. Dr. Sininger has talked about Montana being yet another sacrifice zone of the tar sands to maximize, you know, for them to maximize corporate profits. You know, that includes the Fort Chip people. That's a sacrifice zone that involves actual human life being sacrificed to maximize corporate profits. Because if those externalized costs were internalized by the corporation, would they be sending all of these things downstream that kill people? One of the things that we can do locally here is through hard work, and it's a step-by-step, tiny step-by-step process, but require them to internalize costs that they're trying to put onto the public, onto the people of Montana. One cost, for example, that was mentioned earlier, what if you are stuck behind one of these things in an emergency, a medical emergency situation? You know, when they use these loads on these roads of this size, it's necessarily exclusive to all other uses, including if you're having a heart attack in your car and you don't make it to the hospital within that magic hour, you die. That has direct economic impacts to your family, well, to you, of course, because you're no longer here, but it has impacts to your community. Who bears those costs? You do. Your community does. Your family does. Unless you require projects like this to not be able to externalize those costs. And that's one of the reasons, you know, I mentioned Montana Environmental Policy Act, and industry hates it because this is the state getting in our business. It causes delays. It increases cost of projects. It results in lost profit and fewer jobs and things like that. Well, you know, MEPA is in its 40th anniversary year this year. It was passed. It's actually the precursor to Montana's constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. It's been under attack basically after it was passed unanimously in 1971. It's been under attack in every legislative session since. This year, there are certain bills out there that are trying to remove all possibility of citizen lawsuits against state agencies for improper MEPA analyses. So MEPA is the only way that we have through government agencies to get companies to internalize costs, to actually look at the impacts that are being caused, and to propose mitigations that remove those detrimental impacts from the projects prior to the state saying, it's okay, go ahead and do this. Once you remove that, you defer to the agency saying, or you refer to the corporation, the company, whoever it is that's applying for the permit, saying, it's okay, we'll take care of you. So.
And the Missoula City Council does want to hear from us. I mean, I talked to one of the city engineers. They're very concerned, but they feel like, how can we discriminate who we give permits to? Absolutely, we could discriminate. We do this in medicine all the time. What's the risk-benefit ratio we're talking about? If the risk is very high and the benefit is, and in this case it's a negative benefit, you bet we can charge whatever we want for that permit. But the Missoula City Council wants to hear from you. The mayor wants to hear from you, and that's our responsibility tonight.
My question pertains to, it is designated wilderness. I lived in Lewiston for a few years, and we passed up that Lochsa several times for my husband to come visit Dr. Milan. Anyway, we were locked out of the wilderness because of landslides, snow slides. We were locked out of Spokane and Coeur d'Alene routes through US 95 because of wind and snow blinds that at the same time as perhaps 4 avalanches in that Lochsa, into the Lochsa River, including one that forced a logger who was alive, he did survive, right into the river. And this was in 07, 08, January of 08, we were locked into Montana for 2 weeks. Could not get through anyway down to the Lochsa, to Lewiston. During that time, it was coming up about this. I wrote one of the first letters to the Missoulian about this last year because I could not understand why we weren't raising Cain, and I had also sent it to Idaho, to Boise, to Lewiston, and it was published. However, with that in mind, why don't we stop them? And this is my question. Because that is designated wilderness. I would think that the national government should be able to take a hold of that, and I don't know where to go with that. But it is. I mean, that is wilderness down through, we can't do anything about it, huh? It is. The roadway isn't, but all of the, right off it, it is. And we have all those rocks, walls. I spent, talking about waiting in line, we spent hour after hour waiting in line to get through the Lochsa when we were building that road, because Lewis and Clark celebration is why the road exists today in the condition that it is in. That, though, I would think, because we have that Gateway Wilderness Park, the what is it? National Gateway to the Wilderness, right off of Highway 12. People come from all over the world there. We spent a lot of times, a week at a time there, and they were everything, all kinds of tourists.
Well, just briefly, the Clearwater and the Lolo National Forest have issued some critical comments about the projects, but they thus far have not gone beyond that stage. One thing that bears mentioning as well is that this area is, through treaty reserved rights and traditional territory, very important to Nez Perce and other tribes. And maybe Marty could say a word about that.
As we all know, that the Nez Perce has come out to say and passed a resolution against this. Myself and I've had some conversations just recently with the tribal council and also with the tribal attorney in trying to figure out different ways. They kind of feel the same way as the city council here, like there's nothing they can really do. Their hands are tied and everything else. And I think that both the city council and the tribe have some options yet. Obviously, the Department of Transportation in Montana has said that, you know, city of Montana has, or city of Missoula has no jurisdiction over this, over the state highway, but yet they require a permit. You know, maybe it's going to take the engineer to say no to a permit and have the city police or the city council say, we're not going to issue the permit, so don't even try coming through here or else we'll stop you. Maybe that's something that the city council needs to, and you as city residents maybe need to push them a little bit more and let them know that you're standing behind that, that you'd stand behind that decision.
My slogan is, such an abomination needs to be stopped. It cannot be regulated.
Right. One of the other things that I'm trying to push with the city, or with the Nez Perce tribe, is to pass a or pass an ordinance essentially saying the same thing as the city of Missoula and issuing permits. And then there's some tribal, you know, sovereignty issues and stuff like that too. So I am trying to work with them on a, but I don't want to say anything too much right now as to what we're looking at, so, thank you.
We have a question here and then one back here with mics.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, panel. I'm curious why the Montana Department of Transportation is waiting for the Idaho Department of Transportation to make a decision. And is there any way we can influence Director Lynch's leanings this way? I mean, doesn't he know the logic or the illogic of sending Exxon's rigs rolling through these roads?
Well, he appeared to at one time. But basically, I think MDT has taken you know, imagine that they granted these permits and people who are opposing the project initiated a lawsuit opposing their decision. You know, the state would be involved in litigation, would have all these expenditures. There would, you know, their decision-making process would be publicly exposed. They would have to answer to all of the problems that may have occurred through that decision-making process. Why do that if you don't have to? It's kind of like, and what, you know, if they were to make their final decision and then it never got through Idaho, it would basically be MDT's own little bridge to nowhere, you know? They would have permits, but these things would have to be airlifted and dropped on Lolo Pass to be able to go through Montana by road. So I think MDT has quite reasonably kind of stepped back from this. And what it also means is that there's still time for them to make the right decision on this. There's still time for Montana state government to act, you know, act in a different way than they signal that they're going to.
Well, they're still spending money on infrastructure, basically preparing for this thing to go through. So who's spending that money?
What's my understanding?
They're still allowing to improve, you know, widen the roads, you know, drop power lines underneath the roads and so forth. I live in Lincoln, and, you know, I drive back and forth all the time, and I see, you know, all summer long they're improving these roads, yet they haven't issued permits. Who's paying for that?
According to the KMTPEA, Exxon is.
Why do we, you know, if they don't have permits, why are we allowing them to change all this infrastructure? It's very similar to the McDonald Gold Mine project, that basically the state allowed them to do all this exploration and then shut them down, which is perfectly fine with me. But then there was huge lawsuits afterwards because, you know, they spent all this money on all this you know, mining exploration, and then all of a sudden they couldn't do it anymore. And then we had real, you know, state lawsuits and everything else. Why are we allowing them to? It's like they've already taken the step. They're already in here. They're already developing these roadways to bring these heavy hauls through. I don't understand it.
Yeah, it's a very good question. What you're talking about is pre-decisional action. You know, under the Montana Environmental Policy Act, the state agency is supposed to complete its analysis of the project and issue a final decision prior to allowing any work that's contemplated in that environmental review document to go ahead. What MDT has done with the utility work is exempted, cut those portions out of the KMTP, claiming that those things have, and I'm using this term in a separate way, but independent utility. In other words, standing alone, they have a usefulness to the Montana public, as in when we bury utility lines, we protect the viewshed of the National Forest. I can't quite figure out what the independent utility is of raising the power lines to everybody else. The only conceivable purpose for doing that is to allow big, high, wide loads to pass under. And Exxon's paying for it. You know, that there's a basis, I would probably say there's a basis for a lawsuit on pre-decisional action. I'm not aware of any new turnout construction that's occurred. Right. I'm not aware of any of the permanent changes, modifications to traffic signals and things like that being undertaken. But again, if we had if groups that are opposing this project had as much money as ExxonMobil, there would have been lawsuits on this. We simply don't.
Go ahead in the back.
I just have a really important announcement to make, which is I'm with Northern Plains Resource Council. I'm from eastern Montana. We're sort of used to being the national sacrifice area. And we've gotten together with many other conservation groups across the state, and we're organizing a rally on the 21st of February in Helena. It's called the For the Love of Montana Rally. And Mr. Gentry and Jay Bob and some others have talked about legislation that is really important, the Montana Environmental Policy Act, our right to a constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment, and all of those things are completely on the chopping block right now. This legislature is having a field day with environmental laws and are trying to get rid of them, repeal our renewable energy standard, things like that, and we have to get together. We have to make our voices heard. So we're trying to get 1,000 people to show up in Helena on the 21st of February, come rain, snow, wind, whatever. And it's going to be at 11 o'clock till 1 o'clock. We're organizing buses and carpooling transportation. I think this is a very important time for all of us to come together. We're going to have fun. We're going to have music. We're going to have some humor and comedy. And I would just encourage everybody to participate in this very important opportunity.
Thank you. I will say it's 9:20. I'm here all night if you want to stay, but the panelists are being generous with their time. So I just want you all to be aware that it is 9:20. We were going to go till 9.
Hello, thank you for speaking this evening, and I'm going to follow up and go back to this question asked by the young man over here about capitalism. I think I want to at least offer one corrective. I think it was Bob. He said that corporate logic is about the bottom line, but I actually think that's capitalist logic. Corporations operate under a bigger structure, and capitalist logic says, let's make money, and that's it. And corporations are just one of the mechanisms or machines that do that. So I guess that's where I want to start, is a little bit with that. I also want to talk about addictions. You mentioned addictions. I thought of 3 tonight, right off the top of my head. One is taking place in the symposium next door, whatever we call that thing. I think that's an orgasm addiction. In here, it's like oil addiction we're talking about. But I also think we're very much addicted to the logic of this system, so much so that we really don't think that there's anything else we can do about it. And so everyone up there is scratching their heads about how we're going to solve this problem. And so I'd like to maybe take a historical perspective here and kind of go back, and maybe for The Economist and Dr. Running, and talk about this in all of the history. If you think about all those IPCC models, is that right? If you think about historical models about development, they coincide with capitalism and oil, right? These are the two main things that we see these things coinciding. And I would wonder if you would offer maybe a time that you could think of, environmentally speaking, where policies that we worked for, struggled for, fought for in protest, where there was a change in the environmental destruction that was taking place. Because if you think back to Butte and mines have been going on, if you can think back in the 1800s, environmental destruction has been a part of industrialization. It's been a part of this rapid effort to develop under capitalism. It's not changed. So it's not that policies have done anything. I mean, maybe they temporarily are like a stay of execution, but eventually we're going to be executed. And we all know that. And I think that's why you won a Nobel Prize, was to acknowledge that we're heading in a direction that we can't go. And to think that we're going to like remedy these problems through democratic action in a liberal democracy, which has proved itself to be a complete failure because of its marriage to capital, and to even talk about economically what unions, so to speak, have done, in the best of times, economically speaking, that would be a purely American perspective about middle class, or a northern, global northern perspective about how that's worked out for Europeans and Americans. Even in those golden times of capitalism, the destruction around the world, the cost of lives in the global south has not changed. So I would actually invite the group to maybe readdress that issue, maybe comment a little bit on the possibility that we're wrong, that this system can't stay, that capitalism is in fact completely opposed, diametrically opposed to the idea of any kind of democratic institutions.
Do I want to say? Let's see here.
Well, I would say every act of consumption is an act of destruction. Takes resources, does something to wherever you got those resources. So that's going to happen no matter what. And that's true of any kind of political economic system you look at throughout the world. Capitalism is a unique institutional arrangement, which, given its sort of way it's rigged, changed the laws and become viewed as ominous and all-powerful, can, really kind of accelerate that process. So it's really more fundamental than just the institutional configuration. I think it's really in terms of how we behave and how we look at what we do at a very basic level. And that's well beyond the reach of economics. It's how we live and how we carry out our daily life. But there is the institutional aspect of that, and how can we change that? And, if I had the answer to that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here tonight. So I guess the other thing I would add is that, corporations are made up of people, and people are usually pretty good. They're pretty decent sorts. It's just when they get sort of this collective psychology in the institution of the corporation and subservient to its aims that makes that end result come out to be so destructive.
But how is that different than the logic of the structure under which it exists? I mean, if the logic is promoting self-interest and profit-seeking motives, if that's the logic of capitalism, it doesn't matter how kind we are or how, individually I act in some sort of ethical way. If the logic promoted around me is
Constantly doing that, then what's the point? What's the point of trying to be like that? And it's really more of a question of sort of spiritual, social vision, and how you get a large enough group or enough small parts and pieces and individual actors and small organizations globally to be doing enough to begin to get to that threshold. I don't know where that is. I don't know if that would happen.
The most multi-dimensional analysis of this that I've probably ever read was a book I just finished a month ago, and it's called Plenitude. And it just came out less than 6 months ago by a professor named Juliet Schor. She's a sociologist and economist, and she did more of an analysis of the economics, the environmental issues, the unemployment issues, the national security issues, the sustainability issues, and that I've ever seen. And it's a brand new book. I hope to get her here for a presidential lecture series. We'll see how that goes. But and you can get it on Amazon for $15. It was just an incredibly in-depth analysis of how America might get itself out of all this. And Plenitude, Plenitude. Plenitude. Juliet Shore.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree with you. I was cutting corners. Clearly, a corporation is a legal fiction. It's a limited liability mechanism. And as a creature of the law, if creature we could call it, it is subject to the law, theoretically. And I think things like the Citizens United case and things like movements to eliminate MEPA may be probably the wrong direction to go with something like this. I mean, when you consider that corporations were used after, like Dr. Sininger said, when corporations became persons in a footnote in a U.S. Supreme Court case, they used the 14th Amendment, which was passed for equal protection of freed slaves, 5 times more than to protect corporate rights in states than any freed slave ever did. So, as a creature of law, it is subject to law, in theory.
I have a quick question for the attorney on the panel, and I'm sorry I can't remember your name, but it's my understanding, reading and listening, that if all the impacts are mitigated by the Montana Department of Transportation, or they've determined that they're mitigated, they're almost forced to issue the permit because of federal statutes and the definition of non-reducible loads. And it's something I've never heard anybody discuss whatsoever. We've got these federal statutes that discuss and define a non-reducible load. And if those statutes were changed or modified, we could downsize the size of these loads over our highway. Do you know anything being done about this or not?
Not really. I'm not familiar with the federal statute related to non-reducible loads. The way I've seen that term defined is how it's been defined by the corporation, by Exxon, by ConocoPhillips. They say that these loads have to be this size and we can't cut them into smaller pieces, non-divisible loads. And so, you know, I'm not aware of any federal law being involved in this. If they can cut these things into smaller pieces and take them on another route, maybe they ought to do that. I know that doesn't answer your question, so.
I have just one comment. I think what Steve was saying about us charging a lot for these permits is at the heart of this. It seems to me that Reserve Avenue is one thing we probably have in our control, and the way I understand this route, if they can't go up Reserve, they're not going to be able to go anywhere else. So I'm hoping that the county council would have the authority to either not issue permits or charge an astronomical amount, and if they feel that they have to put that into a escrow for the figures that you mentioned, Steve, then maybe that's one option we have on the local level.
Well, I had two thoughts in mind. One is that there was a time when Missoula declared itself a nuclear-free zone and wouldn't allow nuclear products, I guess, to travel through Missoula. And that's kind of gone underground. And I saw it still in writing several years ago about Missoula. And the other thing is, nobody's talking about this. I feel like the little story I read about our water being sold to an international corporation is about as freaky as I felt when I saw the little article a year ago last fall about these big trucks that were going to come through town. And I'm not hearing much talk yet about our water being sold to an international corporation. But that's very weird to me because people protect their water. It's the most important thing to life is our water. So to me, there's something strange about these two things happening in tandem. The water going to an international corporation and this great need for water of this process north of us. So just something that I think the magnitude, like the 4 loads being a distraction from the 207 loads, I think the 207 loads plus is a distraction from what's happening about our water rights. I don't know. The city council? I mean, that's very strange to have our water owned by somebody, not even an old guy in California. At least we knew who that was.
Any other questions or comments for the panel?
You know, just one last comment, because I think we're all ready to go. But we started this conference with Pat Pierre from the Salish, Kootenai, Ponderay tribes, and Tony Inkashola. And I think this really addresses also the question about capitalism, is that we really do need to look in our hearts, because what they were saying is that the relationship with the landscape, it's all about relationship, right? But that the relationship was always only take what you need, make sure there was plenty for everyone else, and don't leave any mess behind. And so if we can get back to that basics, because as someone was pointing out, the poison of desire has really ripped our hearts away from us, and we need to take our hearts back because there's a lot to do. And so we need to look at our consumption. We need to look at not taking more than we need. We need to look at giving back to the earth and making sure everyone has enough. As you know, as Americans, we use most of the world's resources. We emit most of the CO2. Desmond Tutu says 185 million Africans are going to die in these next decades because of the behavior of people in the United States. How can we live with that? So I think getting back to the basics, there's capitalism, there's all kinds of stuff, but we need to live with these basic principles of right relationship with each other, with this earth, and with all people. And that's how I would think of closing this. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.